Recorded May 6th, 2024. Good afternoon, Rodney.
Nice catch. Nice
How
catch.
you doing?
I am good. Did you notice? We were talking about this right before the show. I had to update our intro. And did you notice I actually updated it with the proper names and everything? So that was like real quick. We did that. I did like 2 minutes. Um, so I'm at the Mall of America
Mm-hmm.
in Minnesota today and talking about what do you think I'm talking about, Edward?
System Center.
System Center. Yes, GOM. Well,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
actually funny because I did see a video internally last week where there's someone on the SCOM team creating a plugin for SCOM for Copilot for security. I thought, what? What? Anyway, so I talked to one of our ops manager, not ops manager, I'm sorry, Azure Monitor Docs team folks yesterday in the opening for this conference and told him about it, and he about fell off his chair too. Um, so I'm staying at here in this morning had my first session with Morton, good friend of the
Hey.
show, Morton. Him and I talked about it led to we talked about the whole consolidation, the universal console, right, with Sentinel Defender, and then how everything that we're doing at Microsoft, we're continuing to help customers consolidate for efficiency, and it led to Copilot for security discussions. We talked about that quite a bit at the end. And a lot of people are interested, and this is something I don't
Mm-hmm.
think we realize sometimes as Microsoft folks. I think sometimes we work in a silo where we think everything that we're doing, everybody just seems to kind of know about. But I talked to at least 3 people yesterday who had no clue what Copilot for security was, and I explained it to them, and they were wowed and excited about it. So that's really cool being able to talk about something that nobody knows anything about because you can start from scratch at that point.
I
So
could I could say that about the product I cover too, but
yeah,
you sometimes think that the information is just ubiquitous based on the hype. It may not be that, right? People have their own
yeah,
focuses and stuff like that, right?
they
Or
do.
sometimes you tune it out because you've heard about you know generative AI and chat GT, whatever, and perplexity and open all that. So you numb yourself to the AI discussion. But and you said
You, you,
these were Microsoft people?
no, they were not Microsoft people. They
Okay.
were Microsoft customers.
Hmm.
This conference is historically endpoint management, but now since Intune is so clearly defined under the security umbrella, there's a lot of security content here now. And it's super interesting to see people actually interested in security. Um, the It's just oh, by the way, I heard something yesterday and today that there's a product called Copilot for Intune, and
Yes.
but there's not. No, there's not. There's not.
Yeah. How you know it's not?
Huh? It's Copilot for security with the Intune plugin.
Yeah. People will make up stuff, so we'll see.
They do. They do. Everybody wants their own Copilot.
Well, you get Copilot for Copilot next. There you go.
Yeah.
Which is probably not far fetched, right? I was reading an interesting article that with the speed at which the number of current AI companies and everybody who's trying to build AI models, the big boys have almost hoovered up all the data. Um, and because of that, the biggest repositories of data, which were primarily social media,
Mm.
anything that's entertainment based, analytics based, um, they 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 they've absorbed so much information that they think in 2 years there won't be any fresh information to train your models against for two reasons. Um, the primary places are starting to put restrictions on the APIs, Facebook, Meta, Reddit,
Yeah.
all these places, right? Um, a lot of AI companies are skirting the law and as far as rights usage by saying if there's not a policy or law against it, I mean it must be okay to do it. That is not cool. Where they're scouring traditional repositories of information such as news media's repositories of text, print to text, print to digital, and so. now they're trying to figure out where can I find this information to train my models, and now they're going after things that are having a resurgence. Remember MySpace? Think about the tremendous amount of data that they had.
Oh, right.
Data's
Yeah.
relevant. Don't worry about they went out of business 10 years ago or whatever. The data's still there. And think
Yeah.
about PhotoBucket, which has millions of photos.
Oh,
And
wow.
then
Yeah.
I didn't know this. OpenAI created a um, voice to text uh, application called Whisper. They've had it for a while. So they went and transcribed over 1 million hours of YouTube video
Hmm.
into that.
Oh,
And,
right. I think I did read
and
something
Google
about
wasn't
that.
happy,
Yeah.
right? So you're starting to see these AI companies skirt the use of responsible AI, right? Not the use of it, the acquisition of information. That's going to be
Well,
interesting.
I think in some respects, a lot of those companies see responsible AI as responses responsibly instead of what they do with the data. So they're just ensuring that the data is, I don't know, maybe it's just a frame of mind. The data
Well,
is protected and it's only responding and producing things that are non-offensive and unbiased.
and we're looking at it from a standpoint of you're right. We're more, when we say the technologists and those who were looking at some type of governance around it were looking at more on how it was used rather than how the information was acquired.
Yeah,
And that and
yep.
AI didn't create that problem. This is weak data privacy issues in the United States. The European Union may not have this issue, considering that they have as many of laws that enforce that type of stuff around GDPR, some of these other protection mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
And so that's going to be interesting. Hey man, what else are you working on other than speaking up there?
That plus this conference is at the Mall of America. I'm staying in the Radisson Blue. I don't know what they were thinking, but the soap and the shampoo is horrible. So I just went out and bought some soap and bought some shampoo. Um, and I have some other shopping to do today as well because the wife and my grandbaby needs things. So that's it.
Okay, any
Yeah,
excuse to spend more money and be a consumer.
exactly.
I do. Using the hotel stuff, man. You're asking for it. I take my own stuff, man. I'm such a diva. Let me tell you what I worked on today. Someone believed that they had an issue in their environment. Asked me to take a look really quick. Um, and their E5, and it's so much in the Defender portal. It really is so much. So I knew all about,
Yeah.
you know, uh, the release of Microsoft Defender's, not Defender, but the exposure risk management feature. But I've really been going into it and look at it. I want to write something up and take a real good look at that, and look at all the initiatives and the way you go set that stuff up. And another thing that was in there was another feature around devices. It was called um, not high value or high asset devices, but something around when you have matter of fact, why am I guessing? I think I got the portal
Don't
open.
Why don't you have that plugged into Copilot already?
Anyway, if it's in the Fender port, it should automatically be integrated. It's called oh man, I wanted to talk about it. I forgot to do it. Let me see here what I got. I'll have it ready for the show the next time. But it was an interesting feature inside of it that says something about um, highly valuable or something device sets that you can go in and then you can look at scenarios around those devices and build out um, responses to them and everything. And it's not the one at MDE. It's another set. My my apologies for not being prepared. As those that can see the show, I'm not doing it from my usual spot at the house. I'm sort of doing it remotely. So and Roz in the hotel, you in the conference room.
It's hotel, and the
Yeah,
Wi-Fi has been horrible today, so I'm really scared.
yeah, will be fine. Well, I'll definitely have a good update for everyone. I want to run it through its paces in my lab. Um, and we'll mess with it from there. But it has something to do with continuous um, um, exposure threat management. What do they call it? CETA? Oh no, CTEM. continuous threat exposure management, which is the overarching concept around having exposure management, which is in the Defender Port and a couple other things. Was the CTAM initiative? So like Zero Trust is an initiative or a
Yeah.
framework, and it's actually
Yeah.
pretty cool. If during the show I see it, I'll grab it and put it in the show notes. But hey,
All right.
man, we're 15 minutes in. We have our guest who's been on the show before. Super smart, writes a lot of KQL, does a lot of good stuff, logic apps and
A
functions.
lot of really cool new stuff too, I think. So
Yeah. So hey,
Hey,
Chris Stelzer, what's up,
how's it
man?
going, Edward Rod?
Doing all
not
right. How
much,
are
man.
you?
How are you? And
Good.
yeah, well, you should probably introduce yourself again.
Yeah,
I know
awesome. Yeah, I'm
people have
Chris
seen you before,
Stelzer.
but yeah.
Yeah, senior technical specialist, kind of similar to Andrea's role as well. So yeah, I'm basically specialized in really anything Defender, Sentinel. These days, just nothing but Copilot for security, and really kicking the tires on the edges of everyone's imagination of what we can possibly do with this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the cool part about it, if you got the new Microsoft sponsored SCU card. You it's like you can get your SCU credit card, right? And just
Yeah,
charge it to it. You
Yeah.
can do a lot with it. I
What's
got to
that
see a
APR? What's the APR on that?
yeah. Uh, I can't mention the customer's name. They're consuming SCUs like they're grapes.
Yep.
And-
Oh, I
and-
have a customer in early access right now, really doing a lot of logic apps and automation. They're hitting about 60 SCUs with their current level of automation, which is 3 million a year. I don't think that's really realistic long term, but it's interesting to see the types of automations that customers are putting in without any restrictions.
I think that
Yeah,
makes a few
man,
people
and I'm s-
listening jealous that they're using that many SCUs. So
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
and then
yeah.
and learned a new term called PTU, what is processor transmission units, which is it measures the way that the queries are actually being processed and used versus the SCU that's being paid for the queries. I'm sorry, the plugins and the
Hmm.
prompts that are happening. So I saw a chart,
Hmm.
and that's how I saw the customers like, oh my God, they're burning through SCUs, right? And they're like, yeah, they're doing some amazing stuff. They're trying to do what you said, Chris. They're
Yeah,
pushing the limits to see, can
yeah.
I do these things in it? Um, but hey, you're on the show to talk about Copilot today and some interesting things around plugins. So
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I pivoted a lot of the work I did years ago before we even announced Copilot. I was working with Azure OpenAI and Sentinel, and when the APIs came out for ChatGPT for function calling, I was on talking about some of the cool stuff there. So I basically kind of just pivoted and repurposed all the skills and technology I've learned in the last year and put it towards custom plugins in Copilot to kind of use our official solution to develop really whatever you can think of from an imaginative fashion and how it might fit within your security workloads, right? So yeah, happy to kind of go into some detailed examples of custom plugins. We've got an awesome GitHub repository that we've started on our Azure GitHub called Copilot for Security. Someone can drop a link in, I'm sure. Lots of custom plugins there and those types of things. So yeah, by all means, we can get into it.
it's more interesting. We'll figure out where you're finding a playground for this. Somebody has to pay for this. I want to know where your playground is, so you get to do this.
I use my lab for the most part. We get a little bit of Azure credit, and I just
Mhm.
build SCUs when I need to try them and delete them when they're not in use. And from a lab perspective, it's fine for learning and those types of things. Lots of ways that you can do pretty ample learning, even with like the $200 of MSDN credit. That most customers get. That's enough to build 3-4 SCUs for an afternoon and kick the tires on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can get creative in the way you go about getting the most bang out of your buck, right? Rather
Yeah.
than spending haphazardly. But we can talk about it another thing. We need to have a show about use optimization, perhaps, right?
Oh yeah, and I got some little tips in there. I've been working on some things, to kind of optimize SCU consumption, and by all means, yeah, I'll chat on that as well.
Rod,
Hey,
you was
so
raising your hand.
the plugins.
Hmm.
How many different types of plugins are there? I forgot. There's like three.
Yeah, so I
or
think
is it
there's
four,
four.
or is it
There's a KQL plugin, there's an API plugin, and a GPT plugin. So 3. Yeah.
three? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And those are all obviously. Which ones are you working on the most?
Yeah, it's a mix. I think KQL plugins are the most widely used, especially customers in Defender and Sentinel. And then API plugins close to second, right? I mean, every customer wants to tap into something that they have. I saw a customer wrote a CrowdStrike plugin today. I know bad words on a Microsoft podcast, but we always get asked the question like, when is X vendor going to write a plugin for Copilot? And often do we sit around and wait for vendor to sign up and write a plugin, or do we just take the ownership on ourselves? The difficulty, obviously, with custom plugins is there's a bit of a shared responsibility model there, because as APIs change, schemas change, is it Microsoft's responsibility or is it the vendors, right? We have a ServiceNow solution, and every new iteration of ServiceNow that comes out could introduce game-breaking API changes. Is that ServiceNow's responsibility or is it Microsoft? So, definitely some shared responsibility in this notion of just an infinite number of plugins to tap into that everyone kind of needs to be aware of as well.
Well, I think another thing to kind of highlight is that GitHub repo. I put the link in there, and we'll put it in the show notes as well. There is kind of a community section for plugins, right?
Yep.
So there's the official stuff, and now where are yours going? Is it in the community section?
They are already in there. So the ones that I'll demo today are absolutely in there already. You can take a look at them. I think we'll cover 3 or 4, and they are absolutely already in there under the community-based plugin section.
All right. You want to take over? And
yeah, for sure. Yeah, top my screen share. So, this kind of started with like, I don't like it when Copilot tells me no, when it says, hey, I can't get information. That's like not an answer I like. And it's an easy fix. So I take an example, like a lot of customers will ask Copilot a simple question like, hey, can you give me a summary of my Sentinel costs? And out of the box, Copilot's going to tell you no. It's like, hey, I recommend you just go to the Azure portal and find it. I don't have access to that information and that data. Well, that's just obviously not a good answer. It's not a good experience to be greeted with a no. So the first thing you kind of got to say to yourself is, does this data exist somewhere in my environment that Copilot could retrieve? And in the case of Sentinel usage data, that data exists in log analytics. It's actually, we have a table in Sentinel called the usage table. And that usage table actually documents specific usage and data ingestion per table. So if you kind of know the query to get the cost data out of it, we can take that query and turn it into a custom plugin. Now, you can obviously use Copilot to help you write the KQL query. It's pretty good at that. And I think that whole natural language to KQL is an awesome feature. But once you know the query you want to run, the columns, the formatting, the parameters, it's just far more consistent to turn it into a custom plugin. So anybody can ask a question about Sentinel costs and retrieve that data. So here's an example of, running a KQL query to retrieve cost data. So this is the table name, the table size, and the estimated cost. And it's very easy to sort of tweak this query by just putting in your own sort of dollar per gig amount. If you're on like a, terabyte a day commit, you're going to have a lot cheaper price per gig. So it's very easy to kind of just modify it. Now, this is obviously just for sort of exploratory. This isn't like an invoice or anything like that, but it's accurate enough that you can get some cool value out of here. So the way that you can basically turn this into a custom plugin is very easily through a YAML file, we're calling these. And again, they're just text-based YAML formatting files in which you sort of describe specifically what this particular plugin does. And the critical piece here is obviously the display name and the description of your plugin. Because when you ask Copilot a natural language question like, hey, can you retrieve my Sentinel costs? It uses this display name and description to try to best match what plugin should I trigger to grab this information. So if I were to upload this plugin, as long as any analysts within the environment use the question or have Sentinel cost details in their prompt, this plugin will trigger and sort of retrieve that data from their environment. So what gets interesting is when you basically take this plugin, upload it to the environment, you can basically adapt the different questions. So once this plugin has been imported, you'll see the first time I asked the question, couldn't find a plugin, it told me no. So I simply go under sources, I simply go import that YAML file that I have. And in the case of KQL plugins, it's very simple because it uses permission on behalf of. You just put in your subscription ID, your resource group name, your log analytics workspace, and you're good to go. There's no authentication required. As long as you have access to that log analytics workspace, you're good to go from a plugin perspective. So you can actually upload this plugin, make it available to everybody in your tenant. And as long as the users who are using Copilot have access to that workspace and that table, this plugin will trigger. So second, I basically just rephrase the question, give me a detailed summary with that plugin ingested, and you'll see what basically happens is that KQL query runs, doesn't tell me no anymore, and it retrieves all of that cost detail, table size, estimated cost, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, this is, one example, a rudimentary one. It's just as easy to hop into Copilot or hop into Log Analytics and run the query yourself. There's not a ton of value in this particular example. However, you can rephrase the question to allow Copilot to sort of build on the experience that it has. So rather than me just asking for a simple cost, why don't I ask it for the total, a detailed summary of my Sentinel costs? But I want you, Copilot for Security, to explain what each table is used for and the security value it provides. Also total up the cost to give an average monthly cost, and be sure to give any cost-saving recommendations. So now the same thing happens. KQL plugin triggers, query runs, but rather than just giving me an output of costs, not only does it give me a total cost, but it gives me an average monthly cost, and it explains specifically each table that is within the costing exercise, starting from the most expensive. So you can get a better understanding of why am I spending a ton of money on the perf table? It stores performance data. Looks like AWS CloudTrail is up on the list as well. And if you weren't familiar with the table names and that type of stuff, it's a great way to add that extra bit of value when triggering these different custom plugins in the environment.
I can almost see an additional use of even listing the tables. Could you list the data connectors that are populating those tables? You could say.
So yeah, I mean, you'd have to do some table joins and figure out if you could find that. I mean, if it exists in Log Analytics and you can write a KQL query for it, you could, but having Copilot augment it ad hoc might be a little more difficult. I don't think it would be able to know where to retrieve that data from.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay.
So it's interesting because you can follow up these questions pretty effectively. You'll notice that perf is, heavily costing us a ton of money. First question I would ask Copilot is it wise to store perf logs in Sentinel? Where else could I store them, right? Because performance counters generally aren't security related data. We recommend sort of separating those, breaking them out, putting them in a Log Analytics workspace to save money. And sure enough, that's exactly what it recommends. Hey, we recommend you probably put it in Log Analytics or use a storage account. Put that data and information somewhere else in your environment to potentially save yourself some money.
Yeah, and the money savings would be on one particular side. It would just be the security side, because you're not putting in the LAW where you're getting the Sentinel cost. You're just putting into the LAW for traditional data log storage.
Yeah, you bet.
Well, and the other thing is, these questions you're asking, these are common customer questions. So they could literally answer, instead of contacted Edward and saying, hey, why am I paying for this? They could just, they ask Edward for Copilot.
So it's interesting. It's not, I mean, I always get asked, why can't I just, have a save query in Log Analytics and go run it? And it's about bringing context and meaning to the data you're looking at. You're not staring at 2 lines of KQL as results. You're really bringing context and meaning. The other example that I can show that's also on our GitHub page is, think about like third-party logs. Sentinel is an amazing product. It connects to really anything that we have connectors for. GCP is a good example, right? You can have Google Cloud Platform logs that you can connect to within the environment. You could ask, obviously, Copilot to maybe write you a KQL query to find those GCP audit logs, but I know where those logs are. I know what columns I want returned. I know if anybody asks for GCP audit logs, I know exactly where to retrieve that data and the format that I want it in. And custom plugins, you should build them as flexible as possible. So one example is, this custom plugin has 4 different parameters: a username, an IP address, and a time and date range. This means that anybody can ask for GCP audit logs, but specify a different UPN, a different IP address, and a different time and date range. And time and date ranges are really cool because, you could say in the last 90 days, or you could say between March 1st and March 7th. And it's kind of magic in how these large language models populate these parameters. It'll automatically fill in that time and date range based on your question, no matter how you ask that time and date range. So it's nice and flexible. This one plugin can support the ability to ask for username, IP, and really any flexible time and date range. Now, obviously, just running this query will give you the output. You can do this within Sentinel. But alternatively, now I can ask it to describe in detail the audit log operations for this user within the last 90 days. And not only does that, again, plugin selection occur, the KQL query runs, but if you're a junior analyst and you don't have experience in GCP, I'm no GCP expert by any means. I don't really understand what a sync is or those types of things, these terminologies used within GCP. But Copilot for Security kind of it has a lot of that knowledge based on its LLM and its training. It understands what a logging sync is within a GCP project, and it explains to me specifically that looks like a filter change was made on a sync, adding what we call data access logs to that sync on April 1st. So it's actually really explained to the analyst the exact change that took place, not just sort of outputted a bunch of garbage KQL results that I have to spend sort of 15 minutes sort of making sense of within the environment. So another cool example of really sort of looking at third-party data that might exist within Sentinel as well.
So let's go back to a basic
Yeah.
plugin creation. Can I go back to either one would work?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
When you're looking at your descriptions,
Yeah.
and you were saying they had 4 data fields for this one, the one that says to date time,
Yeah.
where is it referencing that in the KQL query?
So it's right here. Basically, I just have a simple parameter from date time to date time, and this is what the plugin's going to populate. And that is basically used within my KQL query here, where date time is between from date time to date time.
Okay. So you're using an alias of a sort inside of it to map the description to the KQL query line inside of it.
Yeah. So yeah, as soon as you say, 90 days, Copilot for Security will fill in these parameters, which will populate the from and time and date range within the KQL query and include it as part of that parameter. So when it does do the lookup, it will look up date between these time and date ranges.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. And this example is exactly on our GitHub repo as is, so you can take a peek. But it's really easy. Like once you understand the general syntax and formatting, I've had a lot of customers just copy paste this example because most of the logs you retrieve from Sentinel, UPN, IP, and time and date range are pretty common. You can literally keep the top part and just modify sort of what logs you want to look at. You want to look at firewall, you want to look at, ServiceNow logs, whatever else you have in the environment, pretty easy to pivot.
Okay. We might need to have you come on and do a whole series on plugin creation. Right? Plugins, right? We'll call it plugnagamous. We'll
definitely a lot of fun for sure. And the other one is like data lakes. A lot of customers have these. They're called Azure Data Explorer, and it's an alternative place to store large amounts of data. And you can write Azure Data Explorer plugins. You can actually specify as part of your plugin, rather than a log analytics workspace, specify a Azure Data Explorer cluster. And this means that you can run KQL queries against massive data sets in incredibly long periods of time. Like we have customers who have 5, 6, 7 years of logs in some of these really large data lakes. So the ability to also target these data lakes with these custom plugins is pretty powerful. So in this case, I basically, if you had all of your sign-in logs archived for 7, 10 years in a data lake, it's a lot more cost effective than keeping them in Sentinel. After Sentinel data ages out, we can generally move stuff to either archive or in this case, customers maybe archive into a data lake. So in this case, you can ask specifically, hey, I want you to search for the sign-in log results for this user between this time and date. And this is neat because you can actually look back years. You could say, hey, in this case, I'm asking on October, way back in last year. So like over 6 months ago, what did this person do from a sign-in logs perspective? And we can, again, run that query directly against the data lake. You can see the plugin was chosen, run a KQL query against my data lake, retrieve and sort of explain those results from that particular different data source.
Now, I would ask this: if you're running this, what is the expectation of an output? One of the things I've heard is that when the copilots are running, there is nothing that is indicating that they are doing the things in the background to do it. So people love progress meters, right? And you don't really see that a lot. It's like searching, looking. If someone was to run this one in particular, and you do a hypothetical 7 years back, to just say we need 7 years of data, what's the expectation on the completion of this plugin to complete? I think you need to have some type of logical reference as the further I go back, the longer it's going to take, and the longer it takes to give me the results, the more it costs.
Definitely. I mean, this all backs in, how is your Azure Data Explorer cluster built? Is it spec'd with enough speed and enough high storage, high capacity and high performance disk to retrieve the data that you need in an effective time frame? But basically, yeah, if you were running really slow disk in your data lake and you were running a query that was a lot of data, essentially this particular plugin execution, the ability to grab this plugin and run this query, this would be your progress meter. It might take 3-4 minutes to run this query against your data lake. It might take a little bit longer depending on how that data lake is sort of spec'd.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
Makes sense.
And API plugins are the other big one that I get involved with, because I mean everything is API driven these days. I laugh and say the whole learn PowerShell or learn what you like fries with that is really learn APIs. If you don't know how to really interact with an API, you're in a lot of trouble, because everything is API driven these days, right? So API plugins are another form of plugins, and it's how a lot of the existing plugins we have within Copilot work. And one example that I did publish is integrating with an API like Abuse IPDB. It's another form of threat intelligence. It's a nice one because it's sort of crowdsourced, and you get a lot of feedback about, what are these IP addresses reporting in terms of what are they seeing, quantity of reports, the port numbers that are being reported from different sources. You can see here this IP that we'll pick on has been reported 25,000 times, from a country of Italy, and 100% confidence of abuse. So if I wanted Copilot just for security to be able to use an IP and tap into this information, I can write an API plugin for it. So the way that you work with API plugins are really get familiar with Postman. You got to kind of know how the APIs work before you turn something into an API plugin. You need to know specifically, how do you call the API? What are the different parameters that you need to use within the API? And how does the API's authentication work? Those are kind of the critical components. So I always like to say, use Postman, get familiar with playing around with this API before you try to turn it into a custom plugin. So in this case, this Abuse IPDB has a free API. You need an API key. This particular API, it uses the reports API with an IP address parameter. So essentially, I'm calling a single API with a single parameter of an IP address. So very easy to turn this into a custom plugin. As an example, I can bring up what an API-driven plugin looks like. And it's based on the Open API Spec version 3. And again, be very descriptive on your title and your description.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, this plugin is saying, anytime this plugin is called, I want you to call this endpoint. So it's going to do an API call to this endpoint. I want to use the reports path. Remember, I showed you in Postman /reports, and it takes a single query parameter of IP address. So this is sort of the schema and the definition of an API-driven plugin. You need to know, is it a query parameter? Is it a path parameter? How do I do authentications? But once you kind of get over that little bit of hurdle, this is all this Abuse IPDB plugin is. It's literally that simple from a plugin perspective. So this one is also published on our GitHub repository as well. And the idea behind, once I upload this one, API plugins are a little different because they take authentication. So you would actually configure authentication when you upload the plugin. You drop in the API key and it would store it securely within Copilot. But once that API plugin is there and it's good to go, basically you have the opportunity to simply ask question, can you summarize the Abuse IPDB information for this particular IP address? You can see plugin selection occurs. It grabs that IP address. It lets me know specifically how many times it's been reported with a list of outputs, that API would basically give. Now, a lot of these APIs are pretty noisy, so you need to kind of really tailor your question, because it's going to call that API. And if I look at basically what happens when that API is called, that's a lot of data that comes back for a single IP. You kind of need to be a little bit specific over what do you want it to do. Summarize the details, look for certain attributes. So following up that question, saying something more concrete, like, give me a table of the last 25 reported port scans for this IP coming from Abuse IPDB. And that's a little bit more of a concrete question. Same API call happens, but it's giving me a much more structured output. In this case, it makes the API call, retrieves all of those port scans, and then formats it in a nice table. So in this case, it's given me the last 25 reported port scans within that request.
So my thing, the gears above my head are turning. Like, we have numerous copilots within Microsoft. So let's say Bing Copilot. I wonder if I could write a request or a prompt, whatever we call them these days, for it to say, write a plugin for Copilot for security, write an API plugin for Copilot for security to query a hash on virus total.
Yeah.
And would it give me would it give me
it's not, it wasn't designed initially. Now, what you could do is say, here is what maybe the Open API spec looks like. Here's an example YAML file. Here's what the schema of the virus total API looks like. And then a third prompt, can you help make me a plugin that meets, here's the virus total schema and an API request, and here's, what a plugin looks like. So using some examples, you could help you write that YAML and help contribute it, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think a more effective question would be not to try to write the plugin, but say, help me draft an API connection to that using Postman, right? And then you got the framework to be able to go back and use your experience to say, I know where that YAML file should look like now as I go in and populate it.
Yeah, and I think your best bet is use the examples. There's a lot of API plugin examples that are out there that allow you to sort of tap into large amounts of data and look at the different examples and get familiar with Postman. Like, I can't stress that enough, is they have a good API 101 course, I think I referenced the last time I was on, but learn Postman, learn how to interact with those APIs. Because it's pretty neat once you're able to sort of pair these prompts together. Like, if I go back to the GCP prompt, what you'll notice in here is that it looks like a certain IP address actually made that change to the logging sync. I could follow that up with a custom plugin. I could say, hey, what information does Shodan have about the IP address involved? So this actually will take the IP that was found from my first custom plugin looking at the GCP audit logs, and now ask Shodan what it knows about this IP address. And Shodan is cool because it actually graphs the internet all the time, and it lets you know specifically what open ports are running and what version of software is running. And I bring this up because that's how the LastPass breach happened. It was actually a developer working from home that had an unpatched version of Plex. So in this case, if somebody's making a change to my Google Cloud, from an IP address, I want to know what that IP address is running. And in this case, it looks like it's running a Plex media server with a certain version using that Shodan plugin. And Shodan's neat because you can actually ask Shodan, I want to know worldwide, what is the version distribution of Plex media server? So you can understand, is this IP running the latest, or is it like 15 versions out of date? Now, you could go Google what version is the latest of Plex, but that's no fun. I can just say, hey, based on the data from Shodan, give me the version distribution. And it can actually query the Shodan API distribution and actually pull up and say, hey, it looks like version 1401 is being used worldwide by 122,000 users. And in this case, that is the most widely used version. So it might suggest this product's up to date. So it's interesting incorporating all these other custom plugins. And you'll notice when I ask it to summarize this investigation, it actually says, hey, as part of the recommendations is check that Plex media server running on that IP. If the server's not supposed to be running it, it might indicate a potential security issue. So lots of ways that you can kind of chain these custom plugins together to get some pretty cool outputs.
Yeah, give me an idea. I'm watching the updates that are coming out from RSA and a bunch of other stuff that InMap has released a major, dictionary repository and identification database update. And I'm thinking, man, can I use Copilot to plug into InMap for OS fingerprinting to be able to go see some things? So I was scratching my head about that, but much too late last night to be a perfecter. I said, I need to go to bed. I'm gonna be stuck doing this. But I can see that, and you're right. I jumped on your recommendation last year. When you were on last year, and when it got me a paid Postman account and said you need to learn this stuff, right? I had to do it. So call on that. And I got a paid subscription of Shodan. They were giving away a lifetime one for like $50.
Oh yeah, I did lifetime for $50. And a lot of these APIs that I'm calling here, they're free as long as you have that $50 lifetime membership. You're good to go. You can actually call them as much as you want, unlimited, because they're more what we call summary APIs. They're not specific details. So it's, I found a lot of them are just free to use. And I think we actually have an official Microsoft supported showed-in plugin coming. I think I remember seeing it show up in Copilot the other day on a customer. So that one might actually be coming. This one I'm showing you here is a custom one, but I think there's an official one coming as well.
That would
Very
be
cool.
great. So what are you working on now, Chris? Is there
So what I'm
anything
working
top
on
of
now
mind
is,
that-
now that SCUs are like this, like you said, you have the SCU credit card, and
Yep.
we need to be very, very conservative over how we consume SCUs. And I see a lot of examples that where traditional automation is maybe a better fit. Like you've had Andrea on lots talking about the Sentinel Triage Assistant. So one thing that I've been working on lately is sort of how do we integrate some of the traditional automation pieces that we have within the Sentinel Triage Assistant is a great example. It has the ability to do a lot of automation out of the box at virtually no cost. Like you can trigger logic apps using the Triage Assistant to basically gather tons of evidence. Things like, risky devices, risky sign-ins, MFA registration details, job information, job title, department, manager, those types of things. Now, I could ask some of the Copilot questions to do that. I could say, hey, is this user registered for MFA? Who's this person's manager? That's all going to burn through a ton of SCUs, right? And if we've already collected a lot of that information, how can we more effectively use that data within Copilot by sort of collaborating between the two? So here's one example. If you haven't deployed the Sentinel Triage Assistant, go deploy it and use some of that traditional automation to sort of enrich your incidents with comments. So what happens is incident comes in, Triage Assistant runs, and a lot of what is gathered is added as comments on the incident. So who is the user? What's their job title? What's their department? What roles do they hold in Entra? Who's their manager? Are they registered for MFA? What's their investigation priority score in Defender for Cloud Apps, right? We track this almost UEBA score in Defender for Cloud Apps. What devices have they used in the last week? Are those devices vulnerable, right? Devices related to maybe the user. What related alerts exist? Have the user experienced any risky sign-ins in the last week, right? I've seen a lot of these as questions that people can ask Copilot, but again, that's going to draw upon a ton of SEU capacity. So if you're automating a lot of this with logic apps and what we call incident enrichment, you're adding comments, you're enriching that detail. One cool feature that not a ton of people know about that's buried within Copilot is this, what we call incident report skill. Now, it's not to be confused with the incident summary skill. You would actually click on an incident and click generate incident report, right? It's this generate incident report skill. And what's interesting about this skill is this skill actually looks at every comment that was left on the incident when generating the report. So this means any automated enrichment you've done using Stat, using other toolkits, other logic apps, or even manual work the analysts have done. If an analyst says, hey, I assigned the incident to myself, I investigated it, I resolved the incident because I disabled the user account. All of that is actually included in the incident report as well. So if you take a look at what this incident report looks like as an example, it's really extensive in terms of the information it gathered. This incident report would have been generated with a single Copilot prompt. It actually tells me who the user is involved, all the security roles that they have. It looks like the user was on a VIP watch list, and their account was flagged as a top threat, meaning their investigation priority score is high. The machine involved in the incident was identified as medium risk score. The user's devices that they've used in the past week also had a medium risk score and low exposure level. There's a bunch of related alerts involved. The user had 8 MFA failures, 1 MFA fraud, 5 risk detections involving password spray. So the sheer quantity of evidence that we can gather with traditional automation combining with Copilot is really awesome. And now this entire investigative report probably cost me on the measure of half an SCU. Now, if I were to do this in Copilot for security, ask about related devices, ask Entra about job titles, ask identity protection, what risk failures, ask about MFA failures, I'd probably consume 8, 9, 10 SCUs to go through this level of an investigation. But in this case, I let Stat do all of the work, all the heavy lifting, all the enrichment, and I simply trigger an incident report skill within Copilot to get some pretty valuable information. So it's a great way to sort of coordinate the two. Traditional automation is great for what it does. Copilot is great for what it does. And then if I need to, I can open in Copilot, take this incident summary, pivot, or this incident report, open in Copilot, and now have a really good understanding of where I need to further my investigation. I know they've had 8 MFA failures. Maybe I want to dive into that. It looks like the user was also involved in copying sensitive files to a network share. Maybe I want to ask some questions about Purview. I at least have a really good starting point for my investigation.
So you're bouncing between the two Copilot terms. You're saying I ask Copilot, and then I could either go to Copilot for security. So for those who are trying to, translate your words, they're not watching the show live. I see that you're hovering over open in Copilot for security, but up top you said I can ask Copilot. Are you talking two distinct?
Always talking
functions?
Copilot for security in this case. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Make sure. And so pivoting back to the stat really quick.
Yeah.
The deployment of it, has it gotten down to a couple of clicks now out of deploy for Azure Git, or is it still?
Yeah, I should say it's pretty easy now. V2 just got released as generally available. I've been working with some of the engineers, the odd bug fix, but it's really cool. It's a single Azure function app now. It's not 10 or 15 different logic apps. It's one Azure function. You give it the permission it needs to help triage and gather that data. Yeah, it can take a little bit more work if you want to get into things like risk scoring. In my environment, I let Stat do things like risk scoring, so I can sort of have this really cool integer value on my incidents, because there's probably at 15 or 20 high priority incidents. What should I really focus on? If I sort all the highs by investigation priority and this sort of risk score, I have a better understanding. I can also drive automation. So one thing I published is a logic app that can basically generate those Copilot for security risky incident reports. So it looks for the riskiest incidents in the org, generates those incident reports, and spits them into a team site. So that way you can kind of do a post-mortem at the end of the day, grab the riskiest incidents, have Copilot generate a complete report, spit them into a team site for the SOC manager, and they can take advantage of all that evidence that was automatically triaged using Stat as well.
Very cool. Put it in a central place. I'm watching you navigate the screen. I'm trying to figure out what your presentation software is. That to the right.
I use Epic Pen for my pen. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely, it's great. It allows you to just write and freely. That's probably the number one question I get. Not so much technical. It's what do you use for your pen?
What do you use for that? I think it's pretty. I don't get it with my pen.
So how about a Copilot for Stat? How about that?
I know. So it's funny, actually. I was building with the engineers a GPT module in Stat, so we could take all of the evidence from Stat and just use Azure OpenAI to summarize it. With Copilot for security evolving and that type of stuff, there was a GPT module in V2 of Stat, and I don't think it's in the official release, just because Copilot does it. Honestly, I've been playing around with these incident reports that Copilot generates versus Azure OpenAI and native or just third-party integrated with Stat. And I personally really prefer what Copilot for security outputs as a report. The incident report skill was tailored to generate this report. You have to do nothing other than click generate incident report. Far easier than sort of integrating with Azure OpenAI and sort of building it yourself. There's no customizations I've done in here with Stat. Just native Stat, make sure it leaves the comments on the incident. As long as those comments are there, Copilot can generate an awesome incident report on that data.
You know what this really reminds me of? So going back to the KQL days and how KQL was like the thing that ignited people being able to utilize log analytics and Sentinel and stuff like that. And it kind of had a really deep community feel. This kind of feels like that. So just you showing these plugins, I think, is going to get people excited, kind of energized to see how easy it is potentially for a lot of it. And so we have this GitHub repo. What's the idea here behind these community plugins? Can anyone just create one and share them with the world, or how's that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, feel free. If it's an open source GitHub repository, you can sort of the process. And again, it's outlined sort of in here for community contribution. You create a new fork of the plugin, of the repository, and then go ahead and help contribute your own custom plugin. There's a sort of a code review process when you go upload your custom plugin. So once that's basically done, you can basically contribute to the community-based plugins page. The one around Azure Data Explorer is there. The GCP audit logs one is there, as well as the abuse IPDB one is there. So all three of those I've contributed. And then under logic apps, I think is my incident report one that I generated here. Get risky incident report using stat. So you can take a look at that one as well. But yeah, I have a feeling that our community is growing. There's a lot more contributions. I heard word that maybe the customer who's building the CrowdStrike plugin will actually publish it to our GitHub repo. So absolutely.
I had a CrowdStrike customer in the Copilot for Security session today, which I thought was super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're willing and able to work with really any of the vendors that are out there. It's just, as I said, it's shared responsibility for both partners. So if we do get vendors on board, they have to sort of help maintain those plugins as well. It's not a one and done type of situation.
Yeah, it's definitely a shared model. You can't shoot your nose to spite your face, because if you do create a plugin, you're generating revenue for your competitor, but you're also making your product stay stickier because it seems more usable and flexible, right? You're not being left behind the other current technologies because you don't want to play nice. Because the people will go to where people play nice, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you do it.
There was one question, I think. I don't know if you want to answer that, but we'll just read that real quick. There was just a question because they have a customer that wants to maybe POC Copilot for security. Is that even possible so that they can try this stuff out?
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to build a security compute unit in your environment. As we said, like, I think I work in Canadian dollars. It's about $5.40 per hour is the minimum kind of buy-in. So you can very easily provision some security compute units. We recommend sort of 3 to get started. So you're looking at maybe $15 an hour to get in the door. That's very low cost for a customer to start experimenting and playing with some of the value that it provides. So very easy to POC. You don't even have to reach out to a Microsoft reseller or a license expert. You can just go build a couple of security compute units in your environment and start kicking the tires. I really recommend focusing on the embedded experiences. As I said, the incident report skill, the incident summary. Don't get too overwhelmed with the sheer quantity of capabilities, because you can quickly get lost in a prompt nightmare of trying to sort of make sense of where do I start. So I like to say start small, focus on what's embedded within the Defender portal, a lot of the summary skills, the report skills, before you sort of take a look at we have a really awesome prompt book sample library to kind of give you an idea of what potential sample prompts are out there. Because spoiler alert, there's a lot, right? I mean, it can take a while to get really good at prompting, prompt engineering, know what makes a good prompt. So try to stick to some of the integrated embedded experiences before you kind of really kick the tires on free-form prompting.
Yeah, I sort of did not follow that advice, and now I'm having to go back and retool my bad habit, because I was more into the Security Copilot non-embedded experience, right? And you're gonna be overwhelmed. It's gonna want to satisfy you. It's not gonna say, "Are you sure you want to write this prompt?"
Yeah. It doesn't tell you this is a poor prompt, you should probably reword it. Right? It doesn't have that concept or that guidance. So look at our sample prompts library in GitHub and get a good understanding, because you don't also want to burn through all your SCUs while you're just playing around. That's the other
That's
big
what I was going
right?
to say. A bad prompt is still going to cost something. So
it is. Yes, it absolutely will.
But as all things, KQL creation got better over the years, and Sentinel, you said a good thing. It seemed like they needed something to prompt, no pun intended, for them to get better at KQL, and then the Sentinel got more adopted.
Yeah.
And then people realized, wait a minute, this is our query and hunting language. People got better at creating advanced hunt queries. They just got better at it, and people wrote more and more. I think this is going to be the same thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be an ocean of stuff. You have to skill up to understand where to filter, where in the ocean to navigate.
Yep.
You're going to have to navigate without GPS. You're going to have to need a compass and a sextant.
The way I kind of look at it is we have been stuck in this search engine mentality for so long. We're going to type in 4 words and then expect to sift through 5 pages and then do some vetting ourselves to determine if those results actually were what we were looking for. Prompting, we have to kind of go back to this in-person discussion. You have to give context. You have to ask the question the way that for the answer that you want to be in the response.
And another thing is, I hope this is like sort of like Doug common sense to folks. The experience in the product that Copilot is using to reference when you prompt it, you have to be good at. If you don't
Yeah.
know what you're asking for, you can't take a novice person in MDE or field investigation.
Yep.
It- you got to understand what am I really looking for when
Yep.
I'm asking this. Like, so that's when I tell some people, I'm helping one to listen to the show. Trevor, if you're listening, I'll get to you. Why do you want to do that? Before you get started, and then you can figure out how, and then do it that way. But yeah, I'm going to really dive down into it. I have not put my time into the Copilot thing, other than I'm part of the champs thing. But I really need to dive down. I'm super interested in the prompt, so I'll skill up in that a little bit. For those who are sitting here, once again, you hear the words and you understand English, but really go through to learn to understand what these things mean. Don't use don't use SEUs to teach yourself something solely. Go through to learn and understand what is this? What's an SEU? How do I do this? What is a prompt? What are all these things? What is it? Some people here may not know what a YAML file is. So you need to
Yep.
really understand the components are that you're building upon to be able to do it, right?
Yeah, and try to
Um,
also ask the question, like, could this be done with traditional automation that's a lot more
Mm,
cost effective, right? I always see
there
the
you go.
examples of asking for people's MFA registration and recent risky sign-ins, and a lot of these things, yeah, Copilot can answer, but there's a cost. Every question draws upon those SCUs, can increase your monthly costs. Is it better suited in a more traditional automation fashion, like Logic Apps, which are
yeah,
pennies and pennies to do that type of automation?
because you're essentially bringing on another employee and you're doubling up. You could have just asked this person. Like if you could have asked me, I probably
Yeah.
wouldn't go to Copilot for it. I'd just write the query and I'll tell you exactly where it is. I'll go into the source product and click, click, click.
Exactly.
Here you go. I went into intro identity protection, looked at risky logins thing, exported it out. Here you go. What do you want?
Yeah.
Right.
But
And
you're an
so
expert defender. What about those junior defenders that don't have that experience? That's where Copilot for Security would help in that matter.
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
does. But I agree with you. They would, but they still have to have context a little bit and having an
Yeah.
experienced person to come in and go, yeah, but you didn't narrow the scope down. That's why you got it right here. Look
Yeah.
at it this way here. Don't just look at risky sign-ins. Look at risky sign-ins, with maybe a combination of risky user activity, so you get the more bang for your buck or something. You're right. It's going to help junior folks sort of flatten the learning curve out tremendously, right? If you want to reverse learn, sometimes I'm not a big fan of back in probably why I didn't do well in school when people would say show your work, but I understand that.
That was the
I
worst.
understand
Oh
that
my
now.
goodness. Yeah.
Show your work. I got the answer right, right? Yeah, but I need to
Come
know you
on.
understand the concept. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, hey, I want to say thank you, Chris, for this.
Absolutely.
I'm going to sort of, soft commit you to come back on, man. This topic is more than we can complete in 45 minutes. And
Oh yeah.
anytime you have an update you want to come on, we can make it so that this is a regular occurrence to talk about this, right?
Yeah,
Hey, what are
absolutely.
you
Yeah.
doing? And
Yeah, I think that'd be great because this product and these types of things are really just kind of accelerating even as we just kind of sit here. So there's going to be updates a lot.
Yeah.
and if you haven't seen it, it's out there. Paula Alter just did a huge presentation. It may be out pretty soon where they're talking about their Copilot. And
Yeah.
they showcased it the other day, and they're using the same terminology because they don't want people to be confused by having the perception of learning a totally different concept on how to access theirs. So they're calling theirs prompts. They're calling theirs prompt engineering. They're doing all
Right.
that. They calling
Plugins.
their
Yeah.
skill. They want to do it the exact same way and just say use ours. That makes sense. But they didn't do any live demos, all screenshots. So we'll see how that
Yeah.
turns out. Right. But the interface is cute. It's really nice now. They put some money into the interface, so that's all right. But hey, we're going to close out really strict this day. Rod's traveling, I'm traveling. Chris, thank you so much. I know
No
it's
problem.
way out that way. We'll definitely get you back on. We are thinking about having a more than a single show about this thing, and I think that sometimes we started in the intermediate piece. We didn't really do the base level to our listeners to sort of do it. Now we at
All
intermediate
right.
and quickly going to advanced. We may need to throttle down a little bit, get everybody
Oh
level
yeah.
up,
Bring everybody
then
back.
take off again. Because you're about to leave me behind too. I'm grabbing at ankles right now. So all our listeners, we'll be back. Know that our show is on Mondays and not Wednesdays. Wednesdays were the old show days, and we did them a couple of times because we did it for Women in Cyber Month in March, and we did it for Partner Month in April. Um, our shows are Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So tune in for that. We really appreciate the support. Chris, thanks again, man. You
No
kill it. I
problem.
don't know
Thanks a lot,
I don't know where you find the time to do this stuff.
Part of the
Yeah,
job.
it's awesome. It's awesome. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
See you
We
guys next week.
will talk to you next Monday.